Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar with Barchart and Mintec. We are going to give it one more minute here and then get started. Okay, welcome once again to today's webinar with Commodity by Barchart, as well as Mintec, our guest. My name is Mark Haraburda, and I am the CEO of Barchart. Today, I'm joined by Spencer Wicks, the CEO of Mintec, who is calling in from London. It's 8 p.m. London time, so a little bit late there for Spencer. I'm based in Chicago, 2 p.m. here. Happy to see everyone joining us today for this webinar to talk about commodity prices and more specifically food and food ingredients. I'd like to welcome Spencer.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Great, great. Well, hey, you know, Spencer and Mintec have now partnered with Barchart, and they are part of what is known as the Commodity Price Network, CPN for short. This is a service offered by Barchart where we've got many different third-party contributors of price data, mostly focused around the commodity markets, to our network. We integrate with them, we take their prices in, and we are a distribution channel for the information firms like Mintec provide. And we make that data available through our platforms like our front-end market data and trading platform, Commodity View, as well as through our enterprise services like APIs. So that's the background here. We're going to get started talking food prices with Spencer. To start it off, Spencer, can you tell us about Mintec and what you guys do?
Absolutely, Mark. First of all, very excited to be partnering with Barchart, but let me tell you a bit about Mintec for those who don't know us. We're actually not a new company. We've been around for several decades, and Mintec is a commodity prices and analytics business, but with a particular focus, really on food and beverage, and more broadly, consumer packaged goods. So we are based out of the UK, as you said, Mark, but we actually have a global footprint, international clients. We know many of the largest manufacturers, retailers, food service companies use Mintec data, as well as some of the smaller companies who support them. The heart of our product, if you will, and what you're able to get through Barchart is our enormous global database of commodity prices, specifically wholesale prices, for all those ingredients that go into food making and manufacturing. So the business started with a much smaller database, a much smaller offering, focused really on soft commodities. But as we got to know the procurement teams in various companies, what we understood was actually there was huge demand for visibility on prices for all sorts of things that go into any kind of SKU. So not only the big stuff that you know about, but all the esoterica, the smaller commodities. So that's what we've done. We've amassed that all together, and that is available through our platform and of course through Barchart. Very
nice. So where did you start? What commodities did Mintec first report on?
Well, right back in the day, it was, as I say, in the soft commodities like cocoa and sugar and things like that. But what we found is that there are so many. Some of the big spends are well known to our clients, and what they lack visibility on, and this is where we've taken our direction from, is all the other things they buy. So if you look at if you look at the P&L of a typical food company, you'll see that the biggest cost is the cost of raw materials typically. And whilst they have good visibility on some of the biggest spend items, they may be meats, they may be grains, they may be plastics, actually in aggregate, all the smaller things they buy could be spices, could be preservatives, could be packaging, could be fruit and vegetables. Actually, that's where the spend is, and often these companies don't have that visibility. And so really what Mintec's doing is putting its arms around a global database. It's giving you domestic prices, it's giving you international prices for pretty much everything on a shelf, every SKU that you can think of in the food supply chain. We like to think that we have some kind of representation, and that gives these kind of companies visibility on their spend. And if they're spending wisely, if they're able to go into supplier negotiations and push back on unwarranted inflation, whilst perhaps accepting real market trends, they can really keep an eye on their pennies, because if you put that all together, that's dropping straight to the profit line. And that's typically why Mintec is used by many of these companies.
So it sounds like, I mean, you could price raw materials, you could price a formula that produces a finished product, and the shipping that goes around it entirely.
Yeah, exactly, and that's really is one of the sort of key tools in our platform is the cost modeling function. So as you say, you can have visibility through decades of history on a lot of raw materials. But let's say you wanted to assemble a pizza complete with the cardboard base, plastic packaging, labor, anything like that, shampoo bottle, plant protein burger, anything like that, you could assemble that with all the correct inputs and see how effectively this index for that product. And that's what a lot of our clients are doing. They're actually looking at the whole manufactured product in our system.
Yeah, wow. So I mean, the past 12 months have had to be very interesting for your business. A lot of pressure has been placed on the food sector, from production to the various supply chains to transportation, and all sorts of things impacting that, from stockpiling to shortages elsewhere, to changes in demand at restaurants. So this has to have been an unprecedented time period in your business. Let's talk about that a bit, and talk about the prices for food and what you guys have seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously we can look through the lens of the COVID crisis, which we're still, of course, in the middle of. But if you think about what's happened to food prices and what our clients have seen during coronavirus, it's a really interesting story. And I think the best way to think about it or look at it is through various sort of phases and the factors that influence it. So when you look, through that lens and look at how when the pandemic started back, sort of spring for us at least last year, we definitely feel like we've gone through phases. Remember that first kind of frightening period, then the first lockdown, then there was a kind of a little bit of freedom, then there was a second lockdown. That's certainly what we've experienced in Europe and North America. And I think you can see food prices following that. And so what you saw specifically between sort of March and May last year was the steepest drops and the steepest rises for food prices in particular, because in that very first phase, you saw a number of factors to come together. And effectively what you had during that early phase of the coronavirus was a kind of a new supply-demand dynamic that was specific to COVID. And these factors all came together at a certain time. So the typical supply-demand scenario was abandoned, and what we saw was a kind of a logjam of different issues. So I'm talking about things like, obviously, the logistics restrictions that suddenly hit. So think about the global supply chain, ports stopping, countries closing down. That all happened in a very short time, and that affected lots of different commodities, and perhaps spices is a perfect example. In North America, spices for the most part come from other parts of the world. So when that happened, you saw, prices go through the roof. There was also another factor that happened during that time in that first phase. We saw almost sovereign protectionism. So some countries literally saying, perhaps there were wheat exporters, actually, we're not going to export wheat. We're not going to keep those grains for ourselves. So we saw that effect on the grains complex, for example. But one of the most salient features, at least of that first phase, and you could argue it's still with us very strongly, is the big impact on food service. And that's probably the most personal thing, isn't it? We don't go to cafes anymore, really, or restaurants. We're not going to hotels or on holiday. So think of all that food service industry that was supplying food, which is really shut down. And so you saw that really apparent with things like bakery, confectionery, the dairy sectors, fish, because we're not eating out so much and often not eating those kind of foods. The other sort of factor that was really prevalent, particularly in certain parts of the COVID crisis, was kind of panic buying and stockpiling. So this is a real consumer trend, but it affected things up the supply chain. So this is where people started stockpiling, flour and rice, and you saw some very big rises in those products over a very short period of time. And then, of course, as we started to live more at home and eat at home, which is obviously the flip side of the food service shutdown, we started to change our eating habits, and we also started to look for more sort of immunity and health boosting things. So that affected, vegetables, fruits, and juices. So you can see how all these dynamics play together. And maybe the last factor that's worth touching on, which is related to logistics, are the labour shortages that are particularly affected meat processing and packing, and of course fruit picking. So all those factors came together, and that's why you saw some very large drops and some very large rises, particularly between March and May. And then what you've seen since then is the food supply chain kind of readjust. As it got over that first sort of hiatus, if you will, it started to find new ways to balance things out. And the supply chains reset, and therefore some of the big spikes in prices or big troughs started to readjust and come back almost to normal. Having said that, there are still some significant hangovers that we still experience. These are not directly food, but they affect the food industry. So, a couple of examples would be freight. If you're trying to buy a sea container from East Asia at the moment, you're going to pay 4 to 5 times what you used to. And that's a result of restocking that's suddenly happening, consumer demand from home, PPE being shipped, etc. And so that's not directly a food impact, but it's affecting food companies.
Part of the formula, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I guess the other one would be packaging. So we've seen a real spike in of corrugated materials, cardboard, because that's competing with, our home delivery services we all love. There is a distinct shortage in corrugated materials and cardboard right now, and the food companies are having to take that cost. And so that I would indicate that as a big sort of issue at the moment.
Interesting. So. Yeah, I would like to. I've had up for the past few minutes a screen showing some Mintec prices that have been integrated into Barchart's commodity view platform. Spencer, would you mind talking about a few commodities that have seen some increase in activity, as well as some downward pressure, over the recent period? And while you're doing that, I'll bring up some charts and some data on the screen here for people to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are so many things I can pick on, but maybe I'll try and tie them back to some of those factors I mentioned. So, we talked about spices. North America, Europe imports a lot of its spices, typically from countries like India. So, chili prices, you've got that there on your screen there. India is a major exporter to North America and Europe. 90% of its ports shut down completely. Domestic spice markets shut. So on the flip side, in India, actually the prices dropped because there was a surplus there. Similarly, other spices like turmeric, US couldn't get hold of that. So import prices shot through the roof. And this is classic Mintec territory, as you can hear. This is the kind of stuff that
Wow.
Yeah, it's quite hard to find information, but maybe picking something that's a bit more well known and ties back to some of the at-home trends and the panic buying. We saw a big spike in egg prices last year, and that's kind of eased back off again. But that's a typical example of sort of panic buying and at-home convenience.
Right
and
here,
then then you've got on your screen there a range of orange fruit juices and vegetables and things like that. Yeah, a perfect example of a surge we saw in prices relating to people looking for immune boosting ingredients, health eating at home. That was right across the complex. So carrots, potatoes, apples, oranges, you name it. And we cover all the fruits and vegetables that you can think of at Mintec. Wheat is another big one. Obviously, wheat's and grains generally on a bit of a bull run at the moment for different reasons. But right in the early phases of coronavirus, you saw that because of stockpiling and some of the sort of embargoes on exports that some of the big grain producers we're seeing. So those would be some of the price increases I would pick out. Maybe one other, products like olive oil. Spain and Greece are big producers of that. We have a lot of prices for that in Mintec. There was a big demand from the US for that, and the prices spiked through this year. But when you look on the flip side, again, relating back to those factors that I think are specifically COVID related, price declines. I don't know if you've got a screen for that, but if you think of some of the casualties of food service, often because we're not eating out, we're not going to restaurants, we actually tend to eat slightly different things. And I think the fish and seafood category is a perfect example of that. If you pick out, you could pick out something like salmon. The US imports a lot of farmed salmon from Chile, for example, and prices drop right down during the course of this year.
Right March here into April of 20. Yep.
Yeah, so it's not always a one-dimensional story, but it definitely dropped and then it picked up again. So, and you saw that also across other products like sugar and coffee. Cocoa's another one. Very weak confectionery demand. The reasons we stated. Lack of tourism, lack of visits to sort of restaurants and airports. So there was a big drop in cocoa, and it's kind of equalized a little bit. But another area perhaps to pick on is the dairy complex. So we're talking about cheese, we're talking about milk, we're talking about butter. Big loss in demand through food service, and we're still quite low at prices for that area. So those would be some. But I would definitely say there's prices are starting to pick up again. March last year is very different to what March will be this year. But I think that's a lot to do with, as markets start to open up, as the supply chain has got, rebalanced. It was really caught off guard last year. Things have started to stabilize. And what we're seeing is really the food markets move more in line with its natural fundamentals, if you will, that there's more supply demand and weather impacts. So prices are still going up and down, but they're more back to the sort of normal trends, I would say.
Sure. Well, the extent of data, is just extensive. From industrial to agriculture to protein, different types of protein, fruits and vegetables, packaging. It's amazing how much you Mintec covers. So
yeah, well, Mark, we have 14,500 time series in Mintec. The database is growing. We focus on quality rather than quantity, but we find that we're having to represent more and more things. Quite extensive history for many of those products, and it's arranged, across a number of categories, as you mentioned, and they're not just directly food, because our clients also need, as you say, packaging and metals information and energy data and labour rates. And we have to produce those not only internationally, but also for local domestic markets. So for North America, perhaps a quarter of all our data series are actually North American and relate to prices in different states, not just at a national level.
And even we talked in the past about the increase in plant-based proteins and pricing. You're covering those as well, right?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we really have to keep on top of is sort of the new trends, and a trend we picked up on quite early is obviously the growing demand for, you could call them alternative meats or plant proteins. There's a lot of things that fall under the definition of plant proteins, but if you think specifically of things that substitute meat, they're typically a pea protein concentrate or isolate or soya versions of those. And that demand is growing. The compound annual growth rate of the demand for those products is really, really high. The actual size of the market right now, you could say, is not that big, but we've seen that trend with other areas, and I think this is it's on one track upwards. So we've tried to get in front of that because our clients are demanding that, and what they're demanding is to try and get price visibility on things that their suppliers are telling them, they just don't know. So this again is a sort of classic Mintec mission. Can we help our clients with pricing information to help them in those negotiations, to not get blindsided because they don't know the price? And in the case of some of these plant protein prices I refer to, I'm not aware of anybody else doing these, and they are very, they're getting a lot of attention. But I think that's an example of what I call classic Mintec. It's the esoteric, the opaque markets. Referring back to my earlier comments, a lot of our companies working with us and will have very good visibility on the big products, and they're often exchange traded. But if you think about most of the food ingredients or raw materials, they're not hedgeable through a financial contract. It's certainly not a cleared one, and therefore, where do you get visibility of those? You can run around trying to find those yourself, or you can come to a place like Mintec, and we'll try and provide everything. And of course,
go on.
Well, what that does is give you visibility on that spend that is kind of below the waterline, and if you can get control of that and be armed with what we think is reliable and timely data, that puts you in a much more powerful position vis-a-vis your negotiations.
So where do your prices come from? I mean, take something like pepper, talking spices a little bit. Where do you get those prices for, and how do you ensure the quality of the prices you provide?
Well, that's a really important point. I mean, we're fundamentally, a publisher of data, so we have this sort of routine of, updating our prices, throughout the day, every day. And our key mission is to bring that transparency. So we have got, a pretty much sort of gigantic publishing process. A lot of it's automated in terms of collection. But to answer your question more directly, Mark, that data comes from, a huge range of sources, upwards of 1,000 different sources. So of course we'll collect data from public organisations, supranationals, trade associations, cooperatives. But important, we're also doing our own price discovery. So in some of these markets, plant proteins is a good example, pepper maybe another one. It's nigh on impossible to find independent third-party data to verify what those wholesale prices are. So we're listening really to our clients and trying to then be the company that gets the right specification for those and collect them on time, because these companies don't want to have subscriptions to lots of different companies. They don't want to spend their time. They're in the business of making and selling, food products primarily. So our job is to give that in one convenient box and to deliver it through our platform or through partners like yours. So, and pepper is a good example. You touched on that. Pepper, the main producing markets and exporters are Vietnam, Indonesia, India. So if you went into Mintec, if you go into Barchart, you'll see that we have prices for all those regions and all the specs. So imagine you're buying pepper, but it could be anything. You can look at what's going on in each of these markets. Maybe there's opportunities to, swap markets, arbitrage. Maybe your supplier has got a problem in Vietnam. What's the pricing in Indonesia? So we give, global visibility, and I think that's a really useful, useful service that we provide.
Mm-hmm. So you cover, you have over 14,000 time series and instruments, and you're adding, a lot of new things, new types of foods, plant-based proteins.
Mm-hmm.
So you cover, more generic commodities as well as specialized and more, rare, types of foods. Is there a specific area that Mintec specializes in?
Yeah, I think our reputation really is in providing some of the hard to get food ingredients. So for convenience, we will give you everything you need to know. We'll give you, exchange data and a lot of the information that you can get publicly. But for a lot of the sort of more opaque markets, where, as I say, there's not a exchange traded market, and there are lots of different varieties regionally and by specification. If you just look at the fish data we have, for example, in Barchart, it's pretty mind-boggling. So fish data. So examples of this would be seafood, sweeteners, preservatives, fruits, vegetables, those kind of things. Coffee is an interesting one. We can all see the Robusta and Arabica prices on ice, but what's the price of some of the specific origins, the differentials for fair trade and organic. Those are
Sure.
not easily available. They're available in Mintec. So it's this kind of extra level of transparency we're trying to provide. And I think the nut market is sort of emblematic of that. So nuts is actually a pretty big market. It's distinguished primarily between tree nuts and ground nuts. So in tree nuts, for example, is massive. It's $36 billion traded market. Well, not a lot of people know that, and the biggest in that is almonds at about $9 billion. It's not easy to go and find the prices for various kinds of almonds from California and other markets. You can find that in Mintec with a reference for that. Similarly for ground nuts, even bigger market than tree nuts. Peanuts is the 5th largest oilseed, 46 million tons a year. Again, Mintec's the go-to place to find out all those prices. So this is an example of where we try to specialize. It's in those kind of areas that you can find a great depth of data, and the time-saving component of being able to go there and find it. You don't need teams of people to do that. You don't need to rely on your suppliers. It's consistent, it's timely, there's quality controls for it, and we make it available through our platform, which is also something that you can share with other users. So we provide a lot of convenience in the technology.
So talk about your distribution. You can of course now get Mintec data through Barchart, through our partnership, and you've of course you have your own platform, which I've seen, and it has both price data. You provide market intelligence and analysis within there. I know you provide API access, but if you could talk about your distribution and how people access the information you provide, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so we consider it really a one-stop shop. It's at its heart, it's a SaaS platform, so cloud-based. Users, log in to our platform, and in that, as you say, they can get a wealth of information and analytics. The centerpiece, of course, is the commodity database with the full history on all the series that we talked about. So you can go in there, chart anything you like, do trend analysis on those, set alerts for prices, etc. But then a really neat feature in our platform is the cost modeling function that I mentioned earlier on, where you can pull together all these individual prices, direct and indirect, and effectively model a SKU. So anything, a car wheel, shampoo bottle, tin of soup, anything you're doing. So it might be useful for new product development, or it might be useful to model something that you're getting from a supplier. So you can see the all-in costs, and you can do that by specific weights and percentages. And on top of that, we have a very sophisticated dashboarding system where you can aggregate your own personal views for all the commodities. And we've built into the system the ability to share the charts, share the cost models and dashboards with other users in your organization. So it's that seamless sort of data flow that's really important for teams. And you mentioned the API. That's important because we recognize that some people would like to take the commodity data that we have and actually integrate it into something else they have. It may be SAP, it may be some other platform. And what they're doing typically in the kind of mid to back office functions there are marking to market, benchmarking, so they're benchmarking their buying teams, they're doing risk management. And we also provide in our platform a great deal of market analysis. So our analysts are writing on all these markets, giving forecasts on what the trends are. So that's really the sort of the core of what we offer. And who's using our platform? I mean, that's probably an important.
Yeah,
so,
that would be great.
Yeah, the power users are typically people in the purchasing or procurement function. So these are people who are individually managing a commodity category, if you will, and they are going in personally and logging in, setting up their dashboards, they're looking at their charts, setting their price alerts, checking the mobile app. And these people are responsible for quite often large spends. They're negotiating with suppliers around the year, and so having a tool like this to prepare as they go into a meeting is very powerful. But on the flip side, of course, this is great for sales teams because every manufacturer is selling to a retailer. So how do you evidence that the prices that you want to charge perhaps to a retailer because a price has gone up really is based on facts? Well, Mintec again comes into it. So this is all about having independent fact-based analytics to support negotiations. So that's really the heart of our business, and it's truly global, and it's expanding, particularly in North America.
That's great. That's great. I would like to invite the audience at this time. I've got one more question, but before I ask that, there's a chat window in GoToWebinar where you could type a question. Please feel free to submit any questions right there, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. I'll kind of start that off here, though. My first question I have for you, Spencer, is, or at the end here, is has demand for the prices you supply and the services you supply increased over the past year?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, just judging by our business, and I would say there are two factors at play there. First of all, I would say volatility is our friend. A flat chart is our enemy, you know, and there's heaps loads of volatility, and so people want to know, you know, what's happening in a lot of these markets. But I think more importantly, there's a seismic shift in the food supply chain, and that's around what you might call broadly digitalization or digital transformation. So we've seen that play across, you know, other industries, you know, already. But there's a real feeling that there's momentum growing, and it's often pushed down by, you know, from the boards of companies that, look, you know, we need to get our data in order. We need to have systems that are unified. You know, we're all working from home. We've probably got fewer people. There's volatility in the market. Commodity price data like ours definitely plays a part in that. So we're seeing more and more, you know, mandates or RFPs from particularly the larger manufacturers and retailers, where they're investing considerable amounts of money in assembling an ecosystem to report on this. You know, financial reporting and commodity price data like ours is typically a part of that. So, you know, all the management consultants out there have got this on their table, and they're consulting with boards, and we're seeing, you know, I would say pretty much every month, you know, some new players come and ask us to present to them and integrate. So I see this as a trend that other industries have already sort of seized upon, you know, in aeronautics and automotive already, but the food industry is definitely digitalizing, and the heart of that is understanding pricing information.
Sure, sure. Another one is, and I can take this. It's, you know, I've mentioned it a little bit earlier. You know, how do you get Mintec data via Barchart? And I had up on the screen. I'll bring it back up here. Mintec's data is available via our commodity view platform, which you can see right here. We also can deliver it via, you know, Barchart's consolidated APIs. And second part, Spencer, if you could take, you know, how is your pricing, your data priced in terms of subscriptions? Do you split it up, or is it all, you get everything?
Yes, well, I'm not going to talk publicly about our pricing, you know, in detail on a public call. But what I would say is that we're a SaaS platform, so we charge per user to access the platform, and so basically our standard service is, you know, you get everything in the box. So that's the full history of our data. So you can at the first rung get access for per user to our data history, and then we add on a couple of other services as upgrades. So our cost modeling function is a bolt-on feature, and then all our analytics, our research, our weather data, which I haven't mentioned, is kind of part of our premium service. So we roughly see our client base split a third and a third and a third. So, you know, maybe a third are just using pure commodity data, but increasingly people are buying access to the cost modeling function and then the research piece. And there are new things that we'll be launching throughout the year that hopefully we can announce.
Very, very nice, very nice. So one other one I wanted to bring up here is, you talked about freight and, you know, demand for freight, you know, really driving those prices high. Are you seeing other supply chain issues that are still very active or very evident?
I think the freight is the main one, and it's affecting everybody for the reasons I mentioned. I think, as I say, the issues really are more about, you know, the supply and demand side of things. I think packaging is a big issue. So I think, we're now into, generally as we see food prices rising because markets are opening up, and there's, perhaps the start of the sort of commodity super cycle happening. But I think a lot of companies got on top of their supply chains after the sort of springtime last year, and things started to rebalance more.
Yeah.
And markets are a little bit more loose, and I think we'll see that continue over the next few months.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Well, I don't have any other questions here, so we're gonna wrap it up. I want to thank Spencer very much for joining us from London. And if you'd like to get more information, feel free to reach out to Mintec or Barchart. We'd love to share more examples of their data coverage. So again, Spencer, thank you for your time, and have a great night.
Thank you, Mark.
Take care. Bye-bye.